Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. It's a long one, so get comfy. Before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I am going to be using my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. This is a watercolor medium, however, I will be using my blender pen. I will be stamping the images in VersaFine Nocturne black ink on some Bristol cardstock. The stamp set I am using is Mama Elephant's Fa La La stamp set, and I will be heat embossing these images in clear embossing powder just to make coloring with a liquid medium a little bit easier. Okay, now that we've talked coloring, let's delve into our crime. The 17th stop on our alphabetical journey is Kentucky. Kentucky was admitted into the Union as the 15th state on June 1st, 1792, splitting from Virginia in the process. Kentucky is the only state that has rivers defining 3 of its borders. The state is officially called the Commonwealth of Kentucky, one of 4 states called Commonwealths. The official state dance is clogging. The official state drink is milk, but there are over 10 million barrels of bourbon currently aging in Kentucky, more than 2 for every person in the state. Kentucky is also home to a giant fork, a cow with glasses, and a huge replica of the biblical ark. Not to mention, Kentucky is home to a crime as old as time: love, hate, and revenge. This is the story of the Kentucky tragedy. There are 3 major players in our tale today because, of course, in any tale of love, loss, and revenge, there has to be more than 2 people involved. Anne Cook was born February 7, 1786 in Fairfax County, Virginia, to a wealthy Virginia planter named Giles Cook and his wife, Alicia Payne Cook. Her childhood changed drastically when her father, Giles, died in 1805. Alicia and her 8 children then relocated to Kentucky, changing their lives forever. Of her 7 siblings, of Anne's 7 siblings, wow, words are hard, 6 of them died between the years 1817 and 1823. That means of 8 children, only 2 survived. There is some discrepancy about their lives after the death of Giles. One source says that Anne and her family ran a tavern and boarding house, which led to behaviors, quote, of male customers that a lady of virtue would not appreciate. In other words, a bordello, a house of ill repute, a brothel. According to this source, Anne was a woman without virtue or female chastity. Other sources describe her mother's house as a plantation. In fact, having a library is how she reportedly met her eventual husband. She was described as an olive-skinned woman, petite in stature, with dark eyes and hair and poor dental hygiene. No one, not even her husband in his writings, described her as being beautiful. And in the spring of 1820, Anne claimed that a man named Solomon Sharp had fathered the illegitimate child she was carrying. He denied this. Let's talk about Solomon. Solomon Porcius Sharp was born August 22, 1787, in Washington County, Virginia. He was the 5th child and 3rd son of Captain Thomas and Jean Maxwell Sharp, a Scottish woman. The family briefly moved to the area near Nashville, Tennessee, and then to North Carolina before settling permanently about 1795 in the Logan County area of Kentucky near the Muddy River, and they lived in a log cabin. Solomon attended one of Logan County's academies during his childhood years. The schools in Logan County were very primitive then. He studied hard and read for the law and was admitted to the bar in 1806. He opened a practice in Russellville, but soon relocated to the busier Warren County seat of Bowling Green. In 1809, Sharp was elected to represent Warren County in the Kentucky House of Representatives. He served on a number of committees and for a time served as interim Speaker of the House during the General Assembly's 2nd session. He was reelected in 1810 and 1811. Solomon's political service was interrupted by the War of 1812. On September 18, 1812, he enlisted as a private in the Kentucky militia, serving under Lieutenant Colonel Young Ewing. 12 days later, in a rapid rise even for the militia, he was promoted to major and made part of Ewing's staff. After an uneventful military term, he was eventually promoted to the rank of colonel. One of the things that Solomon had worked on prior to the war in the 1811 legislative session, he worked with Ben Harding on the passage of a bill to ensure that state officers and attorneys at law would not be involved in dueling. Because apparently the preferred method of honor killings in that day was a duel. That's important to remember. In 1812, Solomon was elected to the 13th Congress as a member of the United States House of Representatives and took his seat at the age of 25, the minimum age to hold that seat. Solomon was reelected to the 14th Congress. He supported the controversial Compensation Act of 1816, sponsored by fellow Kentuckian Richard Jones. The measure paid congressmen a flat salary instead of paying them on a daily basis for the days when they were in session. This was unpopular with the voters of his district. When the next congressional session opened in December of 1816, Solomon reversed his position and voted to repeal the law, but the damage was already done, and in the next election, he lost his seat. But in 1817, he was again elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives. After getting established on December 17, 1818, Solomon, at the age of 31, married Eliza T. Scott, the daughter of a physician who had served as an officer in the War of 1812. She was from Frankfort and was above him in social standing. They had 3 children together, and he moved the family to the state capital of Frankfort in 1820 for his political career. In 1821, Solomon began a campaign for a seat in the Kentucky Senate. His opponent, Attorney John Waring, was a notably violent, contentious man, frequently in court because of fights. Waring sent 2 threatening letters to Solomon and on June 18, 1821, published a handbill or a pamphlet or flyer attacking Solomon's character. 5 days later, he ceased campaigning for the senatorial seat. He accepted an appointment by Governor John Adair to the position of Attorney General of Kentucky. Solomon's nomination was unanimously confirmed by the legislature on October 30, 1821. In May or June of 1820, Anne Cook, an unmarried woman in her early 30s, claimed that Solomon was the father of her illegitimate child. He adamantly denied this, and this is part of the reason he withdrew from that Senate campaign. Eventually, the scandal abated for Solomon because Anna had developed a reputation of being, quote, a freethinker, a reader of romantic fiction, and a libertine. And so, even though Solomon's political opponents continued to dig up this allegation of illegitimate child in future campaigns, his reputation remained largely untarnished. The third player in our little story today is a man named Jeroboam Orville Beauchamp. He was born September 6, 1802, in the area that is now Simpson County, Kentucky. He was the second son of Thomas and Sally Beauchamp. Both parents were devout Christians. There was not said a lot about them, but it seems like they were of average, but not means, but not super wealthy. However, he was named after his father, a paternal uncle, who was a senator for that Washington County in Kentucky. So Jeroboam was educated at Dr. Benjamin Thurston's Academy in Barron County, Kentucky, until the age of 16. He realized at that age that his father could not actually provide for the family and pay for him to continue his education. So he found work as a shopkeeper to earn money for education, and he saved money, but he didn't have time to work and study at the same time. Eventually, he was recommended by the Thurston Academy and became a headmaster of a school. And after saving more money, he returned to Thurston School as a student. He later worked even at the school as an usher. So he worked hard to get where he was going. He really wanted to make something of himself. At the age of 18, Jeroboam resolved to study law. While observing the lawyers practicing in Glasgow and Bowling Green, Jeroboam was particularly impressed with the abilities of Solomon Sharp. Solomon had twice been elected to the state legislature and had served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. But he became disenchanted with Solomon when, in 1920, a woman named Anna Cook claimed he was the father of her child, who was born stillborn. Solomon continues to deny paternity, and again, the public opinion favored him, and disgraced Anne went to live with her mom at her mom's home and became a recluse. So Jeroboam's father lived about a mile from Anne's mother, and he wanted to meet Anne. He gradually gained Anne's trust by visiting her under the guise of borrowing books from her library. By the summer of 1821, the two became friends and a courtship began. Jeroboam was 18. Anne was at least 34. Chew on that one for a minute. That is a cougar before cougar was a thing. Anyway, as the courtship progressed, Anne told Jeroboam that before they could be married, he would have to kill Solomon Sharp. Jeroboam agreed to her request, expressing his own desire to dispatch Sharp. Despite Anne stating that Solomon would not accept a challenge to a duel, excuse me, Jeroboam traveled to Frankfurt to gain an audience with him. He had recently been named the state's attorney general by the governor. Jeroboam has written his own account, and according to his account, he bullied and humiliated Solomon so much that Solomon begged for his life. And Jeroboam promised to horsewhip him every day until he consented to a duel. For 2 days, Jeroboam remained in Frankfurt awaiting the duel. He discovered, however, that Solomon had left town, allegedly heading for Bowling Green. Jeroboam rode to Bowling Green only to find that Solomon was not there and was not expected to be there. So Solomon was saved from Jeroboam's first attempt on his life. Anne then resolved to kill Solomon herself. The next time he was in Bowling Green on business, she sent a letter to him that denounced Jeroboam's actions, and she claimed she had broken off all contact with him. She asked Solomon to visit her at her home before he left town. Solomon questioned the messenger who delivered the letter, as he suspected it was a trap. He replied to her saying he would visit at the appointed time, and Jeroboam and Anne awaited the visit, but Solomon never arrived. When Jeroboam rode to Bowling Green to investigate, he learned that Solomon had left for Frankfurt 2 days earlier, leaving behind a substantial amount of unfinished business. Jeroboam concluded that Solomon would eventually have to return to Bowling Green to finish his business there. Determined to wait until Solomon's return, Jeroboam opened a legal practice in the city. Throughout 1822 and 1823, he practiced law and waited for Solomon to return. He never did. Although Jeroboam had not completed the task she set him, Anne married the younger man in mid-June of 1824. Jeroboam immediately hatched another plot to kill Solomon. He began sending letters, each from a different post office and signed with a pseudonym, requesting Solomon's assistance in settling a land claim and asking when he would again be in Green River County. Solomon answered the last letter. He mailed it out June 1825, but he gave no date for his arrival. When Solomon was serving as Attorney General, he became involved in an old court, new court controversy. This conflict was primarily between debtors who sought relief from their financial burdens after the Panic of 1819 and the creditors to whom these obligations were owed. Now, remember that Solomon came from a poor family, and because of his humble beginnings, he sided with the new court. The new court was in favor of forgiving the debt. By 1825, the new court faction's power was on the decline, and in an attempt to bolster the party's influence, Solomon resigned as Attorney General, and in 1825 decided to run for a seat in the Kentucky House of Representatives. His opponent was the old court stalwart John Crittenden. During the campaign, Old Court supporters again raised the issue of Solomon's seduction and abandonment of Anne Cook. Old Court supporters printed handbills that not only accused Solomon of fathering Anne's child, but said that he had denied paternity of the child on the grounds that it was a mulatto, meaning that there was some black ancestry to this child. Solomon said that he never said that, and he said that he was not the father of her child again, but he still won the election. Word of Solomon's claims reached Jeroboam, reviving his resolve to kill him. Jeroboam abandoned the idea of killing Solomon honorably in a duel. Instead, he decided to murder him and cast suspicion on his political enemies. To add to the intrigue, he plotted to commit the murder on the eve of the General Assembly's opening session. Jeroboam rode to Frankfurt on business, arriving in the city on November 6th. Unable to find lodging at local inns, he rented a room in the private residence of the warden of the state penitentiary. Okay, side note here. If you are going from one city to another with the intention of committing a crime, it's probably a bad idea to rent a room from the prison warden. Just keep that in your back pocket next time you're thinking you need to go commit a crime. Don't rent a room from the prison warden. Sometime after midnight, there was a commotion from Jeroboam's room. When the warden investigated, he found the door latch open and the room was unoccupied. So Jeroboam had disguised himself, taken a second set of clothing, which he buried near the Kentucky River, and then proceeded to Solomon's house. Solomon was not at home, but Jeroboam soon found him at a local hotel. So he returned to Solomon's house and hid himself and waited for Solomon to return. And Solomon did come home about midnight. Jeroboam approached the house at about 2 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of November. And this is part of his confession to the encounter. I put on my mask, drew my dagger, and proceeded to the door. I knocked 3 times, loud and quick. Colonel Sharp said, "Who's there?" "Covington," I replied. Colonel Sharp's foot was heard upon the floor. I saw under the door as he approached without a light. I drew my mask over my face, and immediately Colonel Sharp opened the door. I advanced into the room, and with my left hand, I grasped his right wrist. The violence of the grasp made him spring back and tried to disengage his wrist. He said, "What Covington is this?" I replied, "John A. Covington." "I don't know you," said Colonel Sharp. "I know John W. Covington." Mrs. Sharp appeared at the partition door and then disappeared. Seeing her disappear, I said in a persuasive tone of voice, "Come to the light, Colonel, and you will know me." And pulling him by the arm, he came readily to the door, and still holding his wrist with my left hand, I stripped my hat and handkerchief from my forehead and looked into Sharp's face. He knew me the more readily, I imagined, by my long, bush, curly suit of hair. He sprang back and exclaimed in a tone of horror and despair, "Great God, it is him!" And as he said that, he fell on his knees. I let go of his wrist and grasped him by the throat, dashing him against the face of the door, and muttered in his face, "Die, you villain." As I said that, I plunged the dagger into his heart. So that is a quote from a book that was printed based on the letters that Jeroboam wrote before he died. So the wound severed Solomon's aorta, killing him almost instantly. His wife Eliza witnessed the entire scene from the top of the stairs in the house, but Jeroboam fled before he could be identified or captured. He returned to the site where he had buried his change of clothes. He stripped off his disguise, tied it up with a rock, and sank them in the Kentucky River. In his regular clothes, he returned to his room at the warden's house, where he remained until the following morning. After learning of the murder, the Kentucky General Assembly authorized the governor to offer a reward of $3,000 for the arrest and conviction of Solomon's killer. The trustees of the city of Frankfort added a reward of $1,000, and friends of Solomon raised an additional $2,000. So that's $6,000 in 1824 for the reward, as a reward for the capture of the man who killed Solomon. Suspicion for killing Solomon rested entirely on three men: Jeroboam, Waring, and Patrick H. Darby. During Solomon's 1824 campaign for a seat in the Kentucky House of Representatives, Darby had remarked that should Solomon be elected, he would never take his seat and would be as good as a dead man. Waring had made similar threats, boasting that he had already stabbed 6 men. A warrant was sworn out for Waring's arrest, but officials soon learned that he was incapacitated after being shot through both hips the day before Solomon's death. This is the man who had a reputation for being loud and violent and had gone to court a number of times. When Darby discovered he was under suspicion, he began his own investigation into the murder. He traveled to Simpson County, where he met Captain John F. Lowe, who told Darby that Jeroboam had related to him detailed plans for the assassination. He also furnished Darby with a letter that contained damaging admissions against Jeroboam. The night following the murder, Jeroboam stayed at the home of a relative in Bloomfield, and then the next day he traveled to Barnstown, where he spent the night, and he lodged with his brother-in-law in Bowling Green on the night of November 9th before returning home to Glasgow on the 10th. He and Anna had planned to flee to Missouri, but before nightfall, a posse had arrived from Frankfort to arrest him. Jeroboam was taken to Frankfort and tried before an examination court, but Commonwealth's attorney Charles Bibb said that he had not yet collected enough evidence to detain him, so Jeroboam was released. He did agree to stay in Frankfort for 10 days to allow the court to finish its investigation. During this time, Jeroboam wrote letters to John J. Crittenden and George M. Bibb requesting their legal aid in the matter. Neither letter was answered. Meanwhile, Jeroboam's uncle, the state senator Jeroboam, gathered a defense team that included a former senator named John Pope. During the investigation, unsuccessful attempts were made to match a knife taken from Jeroboam upon his arrest to the type of wound observed in Solomon's body. Efforts to match a footprint found near Solomon's house to Jeroboam were similarly, that's a hard word today, unsuccessful. The posse that arrested him had taken a bloody handkerchief from the crime scene, but had lost it along the way back to Frankfort after the arrest. The best evidence presented by the prosecution was the testimony of Solomon's wife, Eliza, saying that she heard the killer's voice and it was distinctly high-pitched. And when given the opportunity to hear Jeroboam's voice, she identified it as that of the killer. So, when questioned, Patrick Darby testified that in 1824, Jeroboam had solicited his services in order to bring suit against Solomon for unspecified charges. During their ensuing conversations, Jeroboam had related the story of Solomon's abandonment of Anna and her child, or Anne, sorry, I keep saying Anna, but it's Anne and her child, swearing that he would kill him one day, even if he had to come to Frankfort and shoot him down in the street. So this is the letter that is supposed to, supposedly hard evidence against Jeroboam. The combined testimonies of Eliza Sharp and Patrick Darby are sufficient to persuade the city magistrates to hold Jeroboam for trial during the circuit court's next term, which began in March of 1826. So Jeroboam was indicted and his trial began May 8, 1826. He pleaded not guilty, but never testified during the trial. Captain Lowe was called to repeat the story he had originally related to Patrick Darby during Jeroboam's threats to kill Solomon. He further testified that Jeroboam returned home following the murder waving a red flag and declaring that he had gained victory. He also turned over to the court a letter from the Beauchamps regarding the murder. In the letter, Jeroboam maintained his innocence but told Lowe that his enemies were plotting against him and asked him to testify in his behalf. The letter gave Lowe several talking points to mention if called to testify, some true, some not true. Eliza Sharp repeated her assertion that the murderer's voice was that of Jeroboam. Joel Scott, the warden who gave Jeroboam lodging the night of the murder, testified that he heard him leave during the night and return later that night. He also mentioned that Jeroboam was extremely inquisitive about the crime upon being told of it the next morning. The most extensive testimony, though, came from Darby, who recounted his 1824 meeting with Jeroboam. And according to Darby, he claimed that Solomon offered him and Anne $1,000, a slave, and 200 acres of land if they would leave him alone. But Solomon later took back that offer, according to this Darby character. So Jeroboam's defense team attempted to discredit Patrick Darby by stressing his association with the old court and suggesting the murder was politically motivated. They also presented witnesses who testified that they knew of no hostility between Jeroboam and Solomon and questioned whether Darby and Jeroboam's 1824 meeting that he was testifying about had ever even occurred. During closing arguments, defense counsel John Pope attempted to discredit Darby, and Darby later reacted to that discreditation, or whatever that word would be, by assaulting one of Pope's co-counselors with a cane. The trial lasted 13 days, and despite the absence of any physical evidence, including a murder weapon, the jury returned a guilty verdict after only an hour of deliberation. On May 19th, Jeroboam was found guilty, and he was sentenced to execution by hanging on June 16th, 1826. During the trial, Anne appealed to John Waring for help on her husband's behalf. She also tried to entice John Lowe to commit perjury and testify on her husband's behalf. Both appeals were denied. On May 20th, Anne was examined by two justices of the peace on suspicion of being an accessory to the murder, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence. At her request, Anne was permitted to stay in the cell with Jeroboam. Pope's request to have the verdict overturned was denied, but the judge granted Jeroboam a stay of execution until July 7th to allow him to produce a written justification of his actions. In it, he said he killed Solomon to defend Anne's honor. Jeroboam had hoped to publish his work before his execution, but because some of the things he wrote were said to have been libelous, the fact that the prosecution witnesses committed perjury and stuff like that, his writings were not published before his execution. The Beauchamps were accused of trying to bribe a guard to let them escape. This effort failed. They also tried to get a letter to Senator Beauchamp asking for his help in escaping. A final plea to the governor for another stay of execution was denied on July 5th. Later that day, the couple attempted a double suicide by taking large doses of laudanum, but both survived. Jeroboam Beauchamp was hanged for Solomon Sharp's murder on July 7th, 1826. On July 7th, the morning of his scheduled execution, Anne requested that the guard allow her privacy while she dressed. She tried another overdose of laudanum, but was unable to keep it down. She had also smuggled a knife into the cell, and the couple attempted another double suicide by stabbing themselves with it. When they were discovered, Anne was taken to the jailer's home and tended to by doctors. But weakened by his own wounds, Jeroboam was loaded onto a cart to be taken to the gallows and hanged before he bled to death. He insisted on seeing his wife before being executed, but doctors told him she was not severely injured and would recover. He protested that not being allowed to see his wife was cruel, and the guards consented to take him to her. Upon arriving, he was angered to see that the doctors had lied to him. Anne was too weak to even speak to him. He remained with her until he could no longer feel her pulse. He kissed her lifeless lips and declared, "For you I lived, for you I die." At the gallows, Jeroboam assured the assembled clergy that he had received salvation. Too weak to stand, he was held upright by 2 men while the noose was tied around his neck. At his request, the 22nd Regiment musicians played Bonaparte's Retreat from Moscow while 5,000 spectators watched his execution. It was the first legal hanging in Kentucky's history. Beaucamp's father requested the bodies of his son and daughter-in-law for burial. The 2 bodies were placed in an embrace in a single coffin as they had requested. They are buried in Maple Grove Cemetery in Bloomfield, Kentucky. The couple's tombstone was engraved with a poem written by Anna. Beaucamp's confession was published in 1826, the same year as the Letters of Anne Cook, the authorship of which is disputed. So here I have added some sketches of Anne and Jeroboam. There is a photograph or a tintype photograph of Solomon. There is also a historical marker that marks the location of Solomon's murder. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. I hope you found this story interesting. I have added a couple of other videos here for you to watch, as well as a subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did so. Give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, and have a really great day.